Relationship between insulin resistance and cardiovascular disease. Find out the details in a brand new study here today on Jimmy Rants. Click on that little box down there in the corner. It'll take you straight to IGTV for today's episode. JimmyRants.com is the website, and as always, you can engage live in the content. Go follow me. I'm over on Instagram. I am at Living Low Carb Man, LIVINLOWCARBMAN. Once you're there, engage live. We are here Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, so thank you so much for being here today. We also simulcast live over here on my Facebook page, where I see Becky just popped in to say hello. Welcome, you guys. Thanks for being here. We also simulcast live over on my YouTube channel. Thank you all for being here today on Jimmy Rants. If you missed the live, you can watch it on replay over here on IGTV. Just as soon as the show is over, we put it right up there, so go check it out on my main page over on Instagram. We also put the past episodes up over on YouTube, generally an hour after the show. That gets up over there. If you type in a keyword, Jimmy Rants, you will find the show. Today on my YouTube channel, I have a Jimmy Rants bonus episode. So those of you that follow me regularly, you know I do two podcasts, the Living La Vida Low Carb Show on Wednesdays, and then Thursdays I do a show called Real Talk. Well, on Wednesday, which is today, I usually have somebody in the world of nutritional health. And today, you guys, I have a very special treat for you. Dr. Tony Hampton, really super cool guy. He's one of the keto doctors out there you may or may not have heard about before. But man, he has such a wealth of wisdom, a heart for reaching people, especially underserved people. Definitely in the Black and brown community. He has a very strong heart for trying to break down barriers, medical barriers that prevents them from getting good health care. So go listen, go watch me interview Dr. Tony Hampton as the Jimmy Rants bonus episode over on YouTube. Or if you prefer to listen, it is on the Living La Vida Low Carb Show podcast today. It will be up here very shortly. So go listen to that podcast, llvlc.com, or wherever you listen to podcasts, my interview with Dr. Tony Hampton. So go check that out. And then finally, you guys, pop on over to the official website for this show. It is jimmyrants.com. You can see all the past episodes there. And if you'd like to show your support, we have a Patreon page and a PayPal link. All of those links are at jimmyrants.com. So today, you guys, I have another study to share with you. And I'm really happy to see that the research world is still hustling and bustling right now, because I've been bringing you a lot of new research that has been coming out in 2020. And quite frankly, it's very exciting stuff that has been crossing the research wires, so to speak. And I've been keeping my eye on it for you guys. I try to keep you on the cutting edge of what's happening in the world of nutritional health, and especially the research world, because not a lot of people are presenting studies and then trying to break them down for you in language that you can understand. So that's my role. That's what I do. It's what I like to do. So here we are. So when you start talking about the subject of insulin resistance, people often hear insulin as the first word in that condition, and they think, oh, that has to do with diabetes. And it very much does. If you have type 2 diabetes, you developed insulin resistance long before you got type 2 diabetes. But I think one of the discussions that is missing when it comes to insulin resistance is all the other things that insulin resistance shows up as. If you have PCOS, you're a woman, you have polycystic ovarian syndrome, that is a form of insulin resistance of your ovaries. If you have fatty liver disease, that is a manifestation of insulin resistance in the liver. So we need to get away from this concept that insulin resistance is only about people with diabetes. Diabetes is merely one of the manifestations of insulin resistance, but it's not the only one. Well, one of the big ones, and the number one killer in America, the number one killer, it's not COVID-19, as much as the media wants you to believe that. The number one killer in America of Americans' chronic disease death rate is heart disease. Cardiovascular disease is a huge issue in this country. And guess what? It is a manifestation of insulin resistance in the heart. And so this study that I have for you here today is going to look at what the association is between insulin resistance and cardiovascular disease. It's a group of people, researchers out of Taiwan did this study, and they actually studied Taiwanese people over the age of 50. It's called a community-based cross-sectional study. So we'll get into that here in just a second about what that is. But insulin resistance and its connection to really every chronic disease that we have, including cancer, including Alzheimer, like literally it all of these areas. Alzheimer's disease is insulin resistance of the brain. Cancer is insulin resistance of your cells. And we have to look at it in that way. And when you start viewing all of these chronic diseases as connected to insulin resistance, it starts to make sense that we're not treating heart disease, we're not treating diabetes, we're not treating Alzheimer's, we're not treating PCOS, we're not treating all of these different things as different things. They're all the same thing. They're all insulin resistance. So moving forward, if we're going to do something about all of these manifestations of insulin resistance, I think we need to be treating the insulin resistance itself. Something I've talked about early and often, and I will keep talking about because it's that important. But let's get into this study. It was published October 1st, 2020. So hot off the presses, and it's in a very obscure kind of journal. In fact, when they do the citation, they always shorten the title. So it's INT period, J period, Environ period, RES period, Public Health 2020. So I took a stab at it. The International Journal of Environmental Resolutions Related to Public Health. So it's close to that. But it's a mouthful. But it did just come out. Again, the researchers were out of the Chang Gung Memorial Hospital in the Department of Family Medicine in Taiwan, associated with Chang Gung University there in Taiwan. They also had some help from colleagues at some other hospitals in the area as well. So let's get into the crux of the study. And if you just joined us, yes, they're looking for what association there is between insulin resistance and cardiovascular disease risk. And they looked at people in Taiwan over the age of 50. So let's take a look. Previous studies have implied that insulin resistance could represent a major underlying abnormality leading to cardiovascular disease. The aim of this study was to evaluate the relationship between IR, insulin resistance, estimated by a homeostasis model assessment of the HOMA-IR index. So we'll explain HOMA-IR here in a minute. And cardiovascular disease risk among middle-aged and elderly Taiwanese individuals. So this was a cross-sectional community-based study. A total of 320 participants were interviewed to collect demographical parameters and blood samples. The recruited participants were then divided into tertiles according to their level of HOMA-IR. They also used the Framingham risk score to calculate according to the 2008 general CVD risk model from the Framingham Heart Study. And their results in this study, you guys, the HOMA-IR index was significantly correlated with the Framingham risk score. And those of you not familiar with the Framingham study, it's probably one of the most famous cardiovascular health studies in the world. They took a whole town of Framingham, Massachusetts, and followed them for a period of time, still following them to this day, to see what impact nutrition choices, lifestyle choices, all these things happen on their cardiovascular risk. And so they've come up with some patterns, and they came up with this Framingham risk score as a result. So they have connected significant correlation between HOMA-IR, which is a very good insulin resistance marker, and this Framingham risk score. And what they found was a higher HOMA-IR level was significantly associated with a higher Framingham risk score, even after they adjusted for things like smoking, fasting plasma glucose, so that's your fasting blood glucose number, systolic blood pressure. All of those things were controlled, and they still saw the significant difference. The area under the receiver operating characteristic curve for the HOMA-IR index, as the predictor of this, was 0.627. That's a little gobbledygook, so don't worry about that. But the optimal HOMA-IR cutoff was 1.215. So they concluded that the HOMA-IR is an independent factor in your risk for cardiovascular disease, but you can't use it as the sole factor in determining whether someone has a higher CVD risk. They're calling for further prospective cohort studies to better assess this relationship between CVD risk and insulin resistance. And if you're just joining us, I am reading from a brand new study, literally just hot off the presses, October 1st. It came out from a bunch of Taiwanese researchers. They're looking at Taiwanese people over the age of 50, and they're trying to see, is their level of insulin resistance, which we know in the Taiwan diet, probably high in rice and other carbohydrates, that they're going to have higher levels of insulin resistance because of that. And so they're trying to put this connection. Does that predict, is that a predictive value of seeing if later down the road they're going to have cardiovascular disease? And what they're saying is, yes, there is a strong association, but it's not strong enough to say only measure HOMA-IR and therefore you will know if they're going to have CVD risk. I would argue if their HOMA-IR is high, then you need to deal with the insulin resistance. Like you can say, okay, it's going to be a predictive factor in CVD. Who cares about that? You want to fix why the insulin resistance is high. And of course, once they start talking about insulin resistance, it depends on who you talk to. I remember I was on a television show a couple of years ago. It was this guy that's got a nationally syndicated show called Ask Dr. Nandy. So Dr. Nandy had me on his show, and I remember he was sitting in the chair next to me, interviewing me for the TV spot. And he was talking about insulin resistance, or he was talking about something related to disease. And I said, well, that's a part of the insulin resistance. And we know the insulin resistance, you have to eat in such a way that you control insulin and blood sugar and inflammation levels, da, 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 da. And he said, well, you're probably going to say they need to eat a ketogenic diet. I said, well, that is an effective way of controlling blood sugar, insulin, and inflammation. He said, well, it's not really the only thing. You need to take into account the inflammatory effects of red meat. I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. If you take the carbohydrate out, there are no major inflammatory effects of red meat. We had like a little mini debate there on his live show. It was kind of fun. But I love having this discussion because in the mainstream, which he is one of them, he's a little bit alternative, but most of the mainstream, they think insulin resistance is related to the amount of fat that you eat, which seems so crazy. Fat is benign in its impact on your insulin and blood sugar levels. Totally benign. And yet they want to say, well, if you limit fat, you'll control the insulin resistance. That makes no sense at all. How about we control the very thing that we know spikes insulin the most? And anybody with a noggin on their head will tell you that's carbohydrates, even the so-called healthy ones. It's going to raise your blood sugar, which makes your insulin levels go up. So getting that insulin resistance under control is key. But I think, and I'm just reading from the abstract so far, they consider HOMA-IR an independent factor for cardiovascular disease so that you can see it as one of the numbers, but they say you can't use it only. I agree, there's probably other factors you could look at, but combine a HOMA-IR with an inflammatory marker and they're both off the charts high, this is a person that is on a one-way trip to cardiovascular disease. Maybe that should have been their conclusion. Use the HOMA-IR, combine it with an HSCRP or homocysteine or some other inflammatory marker, IGF-1. All of those are good markers of inflammation, or even all of them. Do all the markers of insulin resistance, do all the markers of inflammation. Look at those two things in totality, which is probably about 10 to 12 markers, and then come up with some kind of okay, if this is out of line, 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 therefore you're at great risk for cardiovascular disease. I don't think any part of your health is predicated on just one number anyway. So it's interesting. They're like, well, you can't use HOMA-IR alone as an independent marker to determine if someone has CVD risk. And I'm like, yeah, you want to bet? You want to know what one marker most doctors use to tell you if you have a high risk of cardiovascular disease? Anybody want to guess? It's total cholesterol. If your total cholesterol is high, your doctor uses, oh my gosh, you have 301 total cholesterol, you're going to die tomorrow of cardiovascular disease. And they put that fear of God in us so hard. I would say the HOMA IR is much more predictive than a total cholesterol. Anyway, back to the study. I could just rant on and on about insulin resistance all day, but let's get to what they actually found in the study. Introduction. Insulin resistance is thought to be the key mechanism of this thing called metabolic syndrome, a cluster of cardiovascular risk factors. Previous studies have shown that hyperinsulinemia, which means high insulin, was an independent predictor of incident myocardial ischemic events, in other words, heart disease, in a non-diabetic population. IR is also an independent risk factor for various chronic diseases like hypertension, high blood pressure, hepatic steatosis, and steatohepatitis. That's related to your liver, chronic kidney disease, and even lung cancer and Alzheimer's disease. Overnutrition, obesity, and specific dietary components can all trigger IR. No. They always want to talk about this overnutrition. Is it the overnutrition of some random macronutrients? No. Overnutrition, when you overconsume, I suppose if you overconsume anything, you can lead to an insulin resistance response. But the problem is the thing that promotes it the most is carbohydrate. Why don't you explicitly say that in a study? It's not just overnutrition, it's the overconsumption of ultra-processed carbohydrates. Why do they have to skirt around what is the causal factor in something like insulin resistance? Yes, you can also get insulin resistance by over-consuming anything, but I think if you want to be accurate in what you're saying, you don't just say overnutrition, you say overconsumption of the very thing that's causing insulin resistance the most. What's raising blood sugar the most? What's raising insulin the most? What's raising inflammation levels the most? And all of us would agree it's processed carbohydrates. But they can't say that in this study, apparently. Obesity. Obviously, you don't get obese without having some of the overnutrition of processed carbohydrates. Specific dietary components, which again, that's a nice convenient way of dancing around processed carbohydrates, can all trigger insulin resistance. Listen to this. Excess daily calories, fructose, and saturated fat all leads to insulin resistance. So that's what that Ask Dr. Nandy guy was about. He was talking about, oh, well, if you just cut down your fat, And again, I can't fathom for the life of me how fat, with the absence of carbohydrate, is a contributing factor to insulin resistance, unless you're just gorging on it. And then I've interviewed Dr. Richard Bernstein, a very famous low-carb diabetes guy, and he once told me in an interview that I had with him that you could eat anything, and if it distends the gut, in other words, you eat past satiety until you're stuffed. If it distends the gut, you get an insulin response. So I suppose if you overeat to that point, you would get it. But it's not the saturated fatty acids alone. Fructose, I would agree with them on, but daily calories? Why no mention of carbohydrate? It's not even in their list. They also said a lack of polyunsaturated fatty acids and antioxidants. A lack of polyunsaturated fatty acids. So we've talked about the vegetable oils, the omega-6s that are out there in literally everything that we eat. There's no mention in here about omega-3 fats. None. As well as intestinal microbiome imbalance, which again, if you eat the wrong foods, you're going to destroy the good bacteria in your gut. You're going to feed those bad boogers and they're going to overpopulate. So if there's intestinal microbiome imbalance, it's because of a carbohydrate addiction. All of that can increase oxidative stress in the liver and thus lead you to insulin resistance and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. There it is. No mention, once again, other than the fructose. Fructose is not the only thing that impacts insulin resistance? Yes, it does. Because fructose does not impact your blood sugar, but it does go right to that liver. And the liver, when it has to deal with fructose, it can become very fatty. That's a sign of insulin resistance. But processed carbohydrates should have been listed as well. So the hyperinsulinemic euglemic clamp technique is the gold standard for evaluating whether someone has insulin resistance, but it is impractical in clinical practice. Thus, they look for surrogate markers, such as the homeostasis model of assessment of IR. That's called the HOMA-IR. There's another one, if you've ever run an advanced lipid panel, so one of those advanced cholesterol panels, the one I'm specifically thinking of is the NMR lipoprofile test. So that gives you the particle number, the LDLP. It gives you the size of the particle, small LDL, gives you the pattern A or B. And then it gives you this thing called an IR score. LPIR score is what they call it. And it's also a sign like HOMA-IR, which shows your level of insulin resistance. And if you're in the danger zone, you'll be like in a yellow, going towards the danger zone. If you're in the really bad zone, you're in the red. And if you're under, I think it's 25 on that one, you're in the green, which is normal. I would say optimally you want to be pretty low in that because you don't want to show any sign even of a little bit of insulin resistance, because it does then cascade to get worse and worse and worse if you don't deal with it. But they used HOMA-IR for this study. In Taiwan, the 2008 version of the Framingham Risk Score is frequently used by clinicians as a means of estimating a person's cardiovascular disease risk over the next 10 years. Additionally, previous studies have shown that this Framingham Risk Score is applicable in Asian populations. And that's critical because the Framingham Risk Score came from the Framingham Heart Study here in America. Well, you're testing an American population to Taiwanese people, and culturally, that's two different cultures, two different types of foods that they eat, two different types of metabolism and genetics and all these things. So they have to kind of assess that, and they found in previous studies that it was indeed applicable to the Asian population. However, only limited studies have discussed any kind of association between HOMA-IR and this Framingham Risk Score. So obese children with an increased HOMA-IR, they already showed in previous studies, do have a higher risk of CVD. Therefore, the aim of this current study is to investigate the association between the HOMA-IR index and the Framingham Risk Score, and then evaluate the ability of the HOMA-IR score to identify community residents with a high Framingham Risk Score in middle-aged and elderly Taiwanese individuals. Again, if you missed the beginning, this is the study participants were 50 years old or older living in Taiwan. Okay, so what were the materials and methods? Let's take a look at the participants first. This was what's called a cross-sectional study. The participants were recruited through a community health promotion project at a local hospital in Taiwan between February 2014 to August 2014. The project was approved by the Institutional Review Board, and informed consent was signed by all the participants before they enrolled. They had a total of 400 people in the study, all over the age of 50. They lived in this Guishan district. It's a rural district in northeastern Taiwan. And they were recruited. They got general information, including medical history and lifestyle, through interviews with the participants. They had a history of heart disease. 19 of them did. 56 of them were 75 years and older. They got incomplete data from 3 of them. In other words, they asked some questions, they didn't necessarily get answers from 3 of them. Extreme outliers of HOMA-IR were 2 of them. They had extreme outliers. I don't know, were they just so off the charts high with their HOMA-IR that they didn't think it would be relevant, or so low that they didn't think it would be relevant. So they excluded those. Once they removed all of these participants that had contraindications to what they're studying, they had 320 people left to include in the study. So it's kind of cool where they get a pool of people and they kind of whittle it down, because you don't want to have confounding variables with a study participant that will skew your final results. So you got to love that design. Detailed anthropometric measurements such as weight, height, waist circumference, blood pressure were all conducted by trained research assistants or nurses under the supervision of a medical doctor. The measurements of heights was carried out with the subject standing with their feet together. BMI was calculated dividing their weight by their height. Blood pressure was measured with an automated blood pressure machine after the participants were relaxed and seated for over 10 minutes. And then the waist circumference was measured halfway between the iliac crest and the lowest rib at the end of a relaxed expiration. So they had them breathe in and then breathe out. And when they stopped breathing out, they relaxed and they took that measurement. The height meter and weight scale were calibrated once a day so that it would be accurate. The laboratory examinations, they were requested to fast for at least 12 hours, avoid a high-fat diet or alcohol before the blood sample. Interesting. Didn't say anything about avoid eating a heavy carbohydrate meal. Blood samples were stored in a refrigerator at 4 degrees Celsius and then sent to a hospital lab. Clinical biochemistry tests were performed in a hospital lab accredited by the College of American Pathologists. The fasting blood glucose levels, fasting insulin, ALT, creatinine, uric acid, fasting lipid levels, such as triglycerides, high-density lipoprotein, that's HDL, LDL, all of those were measured in this study. So they have a little chart here that shows you how they assess insulin resistance. So rather than me trying to explain it, I'm going to show you. So here is how they determine HOMA-IR. I realize it's backwards, so sorry about that, but I will articulate it here. But I want you to see it first so you can see that equation. So you guys can see it here. So what it is, this is how they use and implement the HOMA-IR. They determine it by going fasting glucose. And you can do this, by the way. So write down this equation and you can figure out what your HOMA-IR score is yourself if you know these numbers. So your fasting glucose is what you need in millimoles per liter. So here in America, we don't do millimoles, we do milligrams per deciliter. So do the conversion of your fasting glucose. If it's like 89, it's going to be like 4 point something with the millimoles. So look that up. Then you multiply that times your fasting insulin, which is measured in MU per ml, which is the standard around the world. So whatever your fasting insulin is. So fasting glucose in millimoles times your fasting insulin, and then divide that number by 22.5. So let's say your fasting glucose is 4.5, okay? And your fasting insulin is 8, all right? So Alexa, what is 4.5 times 8?
4.5 times 8 is 36.
So it's 36, and then you divide it by 22.5. Alexa, what is 36 divided by 22.5?
36 divided by 22.5 is 1.6.
1.6 would be your HOMA-IR score. So then I go down here, and you look at what 1.6 would be. So low HOMA-IR would be below 1.15. Middle range of HOMA-IR is 1.5 to 1.93. So that scenario I just described would be in the middle. And then high HOMA-IR would be anything greater than 1.93. So you can do that test at home, you guys. If you know your fasting glucose and translate it into millimoles, you know your fasting insulin level, you multiply those two numbers and then divide by 22.5. Okay? So that's how they separated them in low HOMA-IR, middle HOMA-IR, which I would say is normal, and then high HOMA-IR. All right. As far as the cardiovascular risk assessments, they use the 2008 Framingham Risk Score to determine this. The risk factors and equations used to calculate the FRS are listed below. So again, they have a chart for men and women, and I will show you that. So here's the charts. Again, this is in this study that we're reading from. They have the chart. It's pretty cool, and I'll explain all this in a second. But in the chart, the risk factors for women is your age times 2.32888. I'm not sure what the multiplying the numbers is, but I assume they they have this equation. So your age times 2.32888 plus your total cholesterol times 1.20904. This must be a part of that Framingham risk score that they've done so many of these over the years. They've determined the pattern. Then you subtract your HDL times 0.70833. Then you add the systolic blood pressure times blood pressure medication factor plus cigarette smoker factor plus diabetes present factor minus 26.1931, and that gives you the FRS. It's just so funny. Like you have to like hop on one leg and pat your head and rub your belly to get this number. But apparently they did this with all of these study participants. So that was in the women. I'm trying to see what they did different in the men. Okay, so you multiply times different things for the men. It's the same factors, but you multiply it times different things. What they're looking for is an FRS defined over 20. So if it's over 20, it's considered high. Okay. All right, so the statistical analysis. So now you know what they're looking at, how they're assessing it, and now trying to make the association between the HOMA-IR and this FRS number. The demographics and clinical characteristics are presented as a means with standard deviations and counts with percentages for continuous and discrete variables respectively. Descriptive statistics were presented, and differences between the groups with different HOMA-IR scores were compared using one-way ANOVA for continuous data and chi-square test for categorical data. Sorry, it's a little bit gobbledygook, but stick with me. The correlation of cardiovascular disease risks and HOMA-IR levels was assessed using this thing called Pearson's analysis. Multiple logistic regression analysis was used to adjust for the covariates. A receiver operating characteristic curve was constructed to assess the performance to see how predictive HOMA-IR was to FRS being high. And da-da-da-da-da. So that's statistically how they went through that. So what were the results? That's what you want to know. The general characteristics of the participants according to the tertile of the HOMA-IR level were summarized in figure 1, which I showed you earlier. Overall, the mean age, the average age was 62, and the average FRS was 14.31. So if you recall, they're looking for ones over 20 that would have a high Framingham risk score. So the average was 14.31, well below that. There were no statistical differences between all three groups, meaning high, HOMA-IR, moderate, and low, concerning their age, creatinine, smoking, alcohol, and regular exercise. However, the mean FRS was significantly higher. In other words, the average of this heart cardiovascular risk marker was significantly higher in the groups that had the higher level of insulin resistance measured by HOMA-IR. The mean FRS was 10.95 for the low HOMA-IR group. Remember, over 20 is what they consider really high. So 10.95 in the low insulin resistance group, 13.94 in the middle one, and then 18.04 in the high one, which they say plus or minus 14.33 on that one. So it gets well over 20 if you get in the plus 14. Other parameters with significant differences between the three groups included SBP, BMI, WC, ALT, FPG, HDL, triglycerides, LDL, and uric acid. So they showed the prevalence of high FRS was higher among those in the HOMA-IR high score tertile than among the two other ones. All right, let's see. So the correlations of the HOMA-IR levels with the CVD risk are obvious. The factors with significant positive correlations were insulin resistance with added BMI, uric acid, triglycerides, and all of that. So, I mean, what they're saying is you can tell from some of these other markers that they ran, you could have had those as a predictive factor. Again, just using HOMA-IR alone, I think HOMA-IR with some of these key ones is going to be the key if they're going to use this clinically as a predictive factor for cardiovascular disease. HDL and LDL showed significant negative correlations with IR. Interesting. All right. All right. So the risk factors. Let's see if there's anything interesting in here. Sometimes you get to a study and you're like in the part of the study where they kind of get in the weeds and you're just like, is there anything of value to add here? So I always try to like on the fly look at this and go, can I translate this, or am I just going to be the Charlie Brown teacher? Wah, 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 wah. Yeah, I think in the risk factors, that's what we're looking at here. Let's move to the discussion because we are at the end of the study. Our study objective was to investigate these associations between insulin resistance and future occurrence of cardiovascular disease. In this community-based cross-sectional study amongst Taiwanese people over the age of 50, the level was positively associated with the Framingham risk score after adjusting for all the confounding variables. Several studies have previously reported a positive correlation between CVD and IR, which is consistent with what we found in our study. HOMA-IR is a frequently used tool as a way to estimate insulin resistance. However, there are only limited studies focusing on the use of HOMA-IR in predicting cardiovascular disease. In our study, participants with high HOMA-IR levels had a higher prevalence of this Framingham risk study compared with those with lower. After you adjusted for all the other risk factors like sex, age, BMI, smoking, and all these other ones that we mentioned previously, the HOMA-IR level was still significantly associated. All of this reinforces the idea that HOMA-IR should be used as an independent risk factor for those looking at cardiovascular risk. We then evaluated the ability of HOMA-IR to identify community residents with a high FRS. However, because of the low specificity and some other analysis, it did not solely predict. So in other words, they were trying to see, can we isolate HOMA-IR and use all of the equations that we came up with as a predictive factor for what we would see, and they did not. There was a correlation when they had high HOMA-IR that they would have this high FRS, Framingham risk score, which would be predictive of cardiovascular disease down the road, but it didn't happen all the time. So they're like, we can't really use that alone. The recent studies have revealed that there are several mechanisms that induce insulin resistance. Here's what they think induces insulin resistance. Let's see if you agree. Genetic defects. Okay, genetics can play a little bit of a role. Again, overnutrition. And again, I would argue overnutrition of processed carbohydrates. Obesity. And again, you don't get obese unless you eat the foods that make you obese. And yes, you can overconsume any food and get obese, but most people overconsume processed carbohydrates as the vast majority of their nutrition when they get fat. And inflammation levels, which again is related to the foods you eat. If you overconsume food and you get obese from said foods, it should not be surprising that you have higher inflammation levels. Again, metabolically, you put your body at that risk because of the carbohydrates that you consumed. In overnutrition status, the extra or excess intracellular free fatty acids will lead to the activation of PKC and NFKB, then induce serine 307 phosphorylation of IRS1, which then inhibits the insulin signal pathway and eventually results in insulin resistance. Okay, that's their fancy way of saying, well, you know, if you eat too much fat, you're going to trigger insulin resistance. It isn't really true. If you take the carbs away, it just doesn't happen. These studies like this don't ever parse that out. Put these same study participants on a carnivore diet or a well-formulated ketogenic diet. Would they get the same results? I don't think so. Excess free fatty acids in cardiomyocytes and endothelial cells also cause serine 307 phosphorylation for IRS1, thus inhibiting the insulin signaling pathway. An inhibited signaling pathway for insulin results in increased free fatty acid oxidation and decreased glucose oxidation in cardiomyocyte and causes cell death. They are trying so hard to avoid saying that eating carbs does this. And I wonder if it's because it's Taiwanese researchers and carbs are kind of a basis of their culture in the form of rice and other things. I wonder if that plays a role in this. And literally, we don't know what they ate or anything in this study. It makes a difference. The early detection of insulin resistance, as well as interventions in lifestyle and dietary components, could decrease the development and progression of insulin resistance and reverse further damage to the liver, heart, and endothelium. In Taiwan, free adult health exams offered by the Health Promotion Administration will cover all the needed parameters to determine this FRS calculation and your fasting glucose, but not fasting insulin. Clinicians do not routinely check for HOMA-IR. They don't do it in America either. It's good to know that some of the same challenges medically and healthcare system-wise that we have here in America, they have around the world. And this is in Taiwan. They're not checking fasting insulin. They're not checking HOMA-IR. Some of you, me mentioning HOMA-IR, this is the first time in your life you've ever heard of that before. And if you joined us late, I gave you the calculation earlier in this Jimmy Rants, how you can run the HOMA-IR on yourself to see what your risk for cardiovascular disease could be. For individuals who have diabetes or obesity, it is easy to link that condition with insulin resistance. Not always, though. It is easy to do it. And trust me, I get judged up, down, and in between about how diseased I am. And I tell people all of my relevant markers in my health, despite having a belly. And they're like, well, that's impossible. No, it's not impossible. It's possible and it's true. You just don't want to believe it because people just automatically assume weight on the body means that you must be greatly diseased. And it's not always the case. However, for high Framingham risk score individuals who are elderly, smokers, or have hypertension, it is harder for clinicians to think about insulin resistance. And yet they should. They're the ones most at risk. This study revealed that HOMA-IR is an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Clinicians should be more alert for insulin resistance in those who have this high FRS and offer lifestyle and dietary interventions earlier for better prognosis. Again, if they think the lifestyle and dietary intervention should be lowering fat, free fatty acids, they're not going to get better if they keep their head in the sand and deny the fact that carbohydrates, especially processed junk food ones, are not serving them well. Then these patients will never get better. Lifestyle interventions and dietary interventions are reported to improve insulin resistance, the lipid profile, and the liver function enzymes. Lifestyle interventions include body weight loss of over 5% of the initial weight, physical activity of 150 minutes per week or more, training exercise for 4 weeks, or a regular exercise program. Again, they're putting a lot of emphasis on movement. Not that movement's bad. I got another study I'm going to read you guys soon that talks about movement being an important part, but specific movement and not just some random physical activity for 150 minutes a week. Dietary interventions, listen to what they want you to do. Dietary interventions include daily caloric restriction by 500 calories from your usual food consumption. So if you eat a crappy garbage diet, they're basically saying cut down 500 calories of that crap. Well, here's the problem. You and I both know what happens. When you eat junk, it's not the volume of the food. You eat a volume of food because you're hungry, because you're stoking an insulin response. And if they're looking at insulin resistance score, HOMA-IR score, why don't you have them remove the carbohydrate calories? And then if they go too low in calories from doing that, add back in more protein, more fat, or more healthy, low impact, low glycemic type of carbohydrates. That would have been a better thing than just an arbitrary reduce it 500 calories from what you usually eat. They do recommend you eat a high protein diet, so that's interesting. So calorie restrict by 500, eat a lot of protein, reduce fructose. I would say eliminate fructose. Fructose doesn't do your body any good. Okay, you get small amounts of it if you have berries and other sources of fruit, but you don't need a lot of fructose in your body. So not just restriction. I think you need to completely eliminate it. And they say here, choose a Mediterranean diet, which everybody thinks Mediterranean diet is this grand diet. The problem is there is no such thing as a Mediterranean diet. The traditional Mediterranean diet is far different than what they're pushing today. The traditional Mediterranean diet had very little carbohydrate on the plate. I have a friend that lives in the Nashville, Tennessee area, and he's from the Mediterranean. Him and his wife actually wrote a book called The Mediterranean Paleo Cooking. And so Nabil and Caitlin were the ones that wrote that book in the paleo world. Go look it up. Mediterranean Paleo Cooking, I believe it was what it was called. And it was all these authentic dishes from the Mediterranean area where he grew up. And it wasn't a lot of carbs. A little bit, but not a lot of carbs. Supplementation with antioxidants, amino acids, vitamins, polyunsaturated fats, prebiotics, probiotics, all have potential benefits but lack sufficient evidence. Well, they can talk about lacking sufficient evidence. I think pushing polyunsaturated fats is a horrible idea. How about having, instead of omega-6 fats, pushing omega-3 fats like fish oil? Doesn't make sense. This study still had some limitations. First, the study was cross-sectional. Therefore, we were unable to explore the cause and effect relationship between FRS and insulin resistance. Second, we do not have a direct outcome measure for cardiovascular disease. Third, and this was a big one here, listen to this. We did not check their A1C level, a much more reliable marker for identifying pre-diabetic and diabetic. Remember, they tested fasting insulin, they tested fasting blood glucose level. But an A1C would have seen what happened the last 3 months. That's basically an average of your blood glucose at all times over the past 3 months. That's what an HbA1C. I wonder if they could go in, but no, they didn't test A1C. Had they tested A1C and replaced in that HOMA IR score the fasting blood glucose with your A1C, I wonder if that would have provided a much more accurate HOMA IR. It's interesting to think about that. Finally, our sample size was small. They had a few hundred people. Further studies are warranted with unknown confounders. All right, so in conclusion, a high FRS over 20% was significantly associated with insulin resistance in middle-aged and elderly population in Taiwan. The use of HOMA IR is an independent risk factor for this high FRS, but cannot be used as a sole predictor. So there it is, you guys. That is the study. If you came in late, definitely go look up this study. It was published October 1st, 2020, so literally hot off the presses. It was published in the International Journal of Environmental Resolutions for Public Health. And the title is The Association Between Insulin Resistance and Cardiovascular Disease Risk, a Community-Based Cross-Sectional Study Among Taiwanese People Aged over 50. All right. So, quite interesting. And I love it that researchers are trying to put this connection between insulin resistance and chronic disease, things like cardiovascular disease. They could have very easily done this same thing with insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. Could it be a predictive factor? And think about all the manifestations of insulin resistance. Cardiovascular disease is one. Type 2 diabetes is one. PCOS, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, all of these chronic diseases of our day, they are all a direct result of you getting insulin resistance first. Which begs the question, if we can find out a way to identify insulin resistance earlier in patients, when you go see a doctor and they identify that you have insulin resistance, do you know how much chronic disease they could prevent down the road if they gave you a way to deal with your insulin resistance now? Guys, this is exciting. We need to be celebrating this kind of research. Now, some of the things they did in the study were horrible, and I identified those in real time as I was going over it, but we need to be celebrating that researchers are giving a closer look to insulin resistance, making that connection with chronic diseases, and maybe, just maybe, in the future, when people go to see their doctor, they're going to be doing this insulin resistance score, and they're going to prevent heart attacks, diabetes, Alzheimer's, cancer, all of these chronic diseases from ever developing long before they do. All right, you guys, I want to see what you guys have to say about this. So we're going to come here first to Instagram, then over to Facebook, finally over to YouTube. Thank you all for being here today on Jimmy Rants. JimmyRants.com is the website. You like what I do, go donate, go help me out. I have a Patreon page and a PayPal link. I really appreciate everyone who supports my work. It helps keep me coming back here every single day. Temple says, I'm so glad you're going over this. Yeah, there's so much coming out, Temple, as far as research that's interesting that, yeah, I try to keep you guys on the cutting edge. And so this one's definitely hot off. Was this October 6th, 7th, whatever it is? So less than a week old study, and you're already getting it here on Jimmy Rants. Joshua says, one of the biggest factors in kidney disease is insulin resistance. Yes. Literally every chronic disease you could possibly think of is related to insulin resistance. It is. Tori, that is a general question asking about how many grams of protein do you eat in a day. That's a general question, and we answer general questions on Friday, so I might ask me anything. So come back with that question on Friday. I'd be happy to answer. Joshua says, this is my biggest beef with the diet culture. Less of a crappy diet will just increase deficiencies and keep you starving. Yes. So when they said just cut down 500 calories from the diet they were already eating, I'm going, well, if it's an inferior diet that's probably pushing them into insulin resistance, a reduction in calories. Of course, it goes back to that overnutrition thing, Joshua. That's why they say cut it by 500 calories. I, again, say eliminate the crap. Like you're saying, get less crap in the diet and you'll get better outcomes. It makes common sense, but common sense never really passes the muster. Rachel says, I'm going to have to rewatch because I came in super late. Yeah, you came in right as I was finishing up with the study, Rachel. So you did miss it, so I hope you watched the replay. Thank you, Instagram. I'm going to move you over here, all comfy over on the side. We're going to go over here to now to my Facebook page. What's up, Facebook? See what you guys have to say. Tracy says, I just lost a good friend this week to a heart attack. He was high risk because of this. It's so hard to see people at risk and can't help them all. So heartbroken. Yeah, my own brother. Died of heart disease, morbid obesity, and type 2 diabetes back in 2008. 41 years old. And I had already lost my weight and was talking about low-carb diets. And yeah, you want to talk about hard. You see someone you know and love and grew up with, and they die needlessly. That hits home hard, doesn't it? Tracy says, I think I will just continue eating my normal low-carb way because it has healed me. Yeah, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's for sure. All right, thank you, Facebook. Now let's pop over to my YouTube channel, see what these guys have to say. Hello, you guys. I love your rant, says Lori. Well, thank you. I love being here. Great comments on the study. Thank you, Harp C. They believe Keys. They are blind to other hypotheses. Yeah, I mean, by the way, Ansel Keys was the inventor of the Mediterranean diet. Did you know that? Like a lot of people, they point to him for his 7-country study, and he's very famous for the very flawed 7-country study that has got us in this low-fat mess to begin with. What a lot of people don't realize is later in his career, he was the one that actually developed the Mediterranean diet. Isn't that interesting? Now, it's been popularized by other people since then, but it was Ansel Keys. As much as we want to rag on him about messing up nutritional health, even to this day, we're still feeling it decades later. He was the one that pushed the Mediterranean diet. Maybe that's why Mediterranean gets such a positive view in our culture. Well, it's the guy that identified the diet heart hypothesis, so he must be onto something. Let's embrace Mediterranean. I don't know. Decor says, is it because sugar is feeding the parasites in the gut? Yeah, well, that's one thing that it does. And not just parasites, but really any bad bug in the body. But the sugar itself actually is, especially when it's overconsumed, typically. And when I say sugar, I'm not just saying white sugar. I'm talking about any carbohydrate that would turn to sugar in the body. you would have this excess glucose. And the body can store glucose in your glycogen stores in various parts of your body, and it could obviously be used for energy when you work out, glycolytically demanding workout. You're burning up a lot of sugar that way. But the problem is your sugar need in your body is so super low. I've talked about this before. Take a guess how much sugar is in your entire body. Every single person has an amount of sugar in their body. What do you think it is? How much sugar do you think is in the body? Like, even of a healthy person, how much sugar is in the body? Would you be shocked to find out 1 teaspoon? 1 teaspoon of sugar in your entire body. So when you consume, and RJB or PJB, you were right, 4.2 grams is correct, nerd. But 4.2 grams is equivalent to 1 teaspoon of sugar. And so if it's just 1 teaspoon of sugar, and how many teaspoons do people drink when they drink a Coca-Cola? That's 11. A can of Coke has 11 teaspoons of sugar. Well, you just bombarded your body with over 10 times the amount of sugar that's in your body. And yet people don't just drink 1. They drink, or in my case, I used to drink 16 of those. And so when you have that excess sugar, it does a whole lot more than feed the bad gut bacteria. It actually has significant, specific, direct metabolic effects on your body. Paula says, wow, new listener here. I did not know that. Yes, a lot of people, they don't realize. You don't think about it. 4.2 grams of sugar in your body. Think about when you test your blood sugar and you get a 100 reading on the meter. That is 4.2 grams of sugar. Okay? And so that's 1 teaspoon of sugar. Pretty stark when you look at it in those terms. But yes, we have great research now, you guys. Go, look it up. And yeah, I'll keep you on the cutting edge here. Thank you so much for watching October 2020 study. They have found a connection between insulin resistance and cardiovascular disease. And we're going to see more and more studies like this, not just with CVD, but with type 2 diabetes and all kinds of things. They are finally finding this relationship between insulin resistance and literally every chronic disease, which has me hopeful that going down the road of trying to help people with their health, we can actually help them long before they go down the disease path. And yes, a low-carb, ketogenic diet, carnivore diet, real food diet will put you one step ahead of everyone, keeping that HOMA IR score on the low end. That's it for this episode of Jimmy Rants. JimmyRants.com is the website. And as always, you can engage live in the content. Go follow me right here. I am on Instagram at Living Low Carb Man, LIVINLOWCARBMAN. Once you're there, you can engage live in the content. We are here Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So thank you for being here. We also simulcast over on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you all for being here today on Jimmy Rants. If you missed the live, you can watch it on replay over on IGTV. As soon as this is over, we'll put it right up on Instagram television, so go check it out there. We also put it up over on YouTube. Type in a keyword, Jimmy Rants. You will find the show. I will remind you, it is Jimmy Rants bonus episode day over on YouTube. Go to my page over there, and I have an interview with Dr. Tony Hampton. He's a medical doctor. I believe he's out of the Chicago, Illinois area. And you can hear what he has to say about how he tries to reach the underserved population there in his city. Great conversation we had. So go check it out. Finally, pop on over to JimmyRants.com, the official website for this show, and you can see all the past episodes, and you can support my work either through Patreon or through a direct donation from PayPal. All of that would be wonderful, you guys, if you love what I do. I love what I do, so I will keep going as long as you support my work. All of those links, JimmyRants.com. What do you think about paleo? Dude, that's the wrong question to ask today. You need to come back on Friday. Ask me anything is when I answer those kinds of questions, but thank you for that. Come back on Friday. I'll be happy to wax eloquently about paleo. I have a few thoughts. Let's just put it that way. All right, guys, I'll be back here again 11 a.m. Eastern tomorrow, and we'll see you then.